It's a crazy feeling to arrive in a different country where you have no experience with the language or culture whatsoever and wait to be dropped off in a household that likewise knows no languages that you are familiar with. You are at the mercy of strangers and the kindness of their hearts to help you succeed in your purpose in this foreign country. My name is Suganthi Gomathinayagam, or Sugi, as my Ukrainian friends call me, and I am a United States Peace Corps volunteer here in the city of Vinnytsia. I work for the NGO Creative to help increase youth civic participation, youth entrepreneurship, critical thinking skills, and leadership skills. I remember my first bus ride to my training site in a small town, or Mistechko, Radomyshl, in Zhytomyrska Oblast nearly 6 months ago. I remember sitting in a bus filled with 35 other Peace Corps volunteers, of whom I considered 35 of my best friends, considering I knew no one else in this country. We were speeding through the vast sunflower fields of Zhytomyr as nerves were rising for each volunteer. I remember arriving at our first destination, the village of Hranitna, where 5 volunteers would be departing. As I eagerly looked out the window, I could see that almost the entire village had come out to welcome their 5 new community members. Babushkas had brought their grandchildren riding tricycles and bicycles. Families had brought their dogs lounging in the August summer. I remember it was a shockingly quick process saying goodbye to our friends as they quickly picked up their bags and were promptly shuffled off the bus. As the bus driver went off on his way, the rest of us simply got a fleeting look out the window where we could faintly see our friends being embraced by their families, faintly hearing words like "krasunya" and "mi sonechko." And what an incredible experience that was for me as a volunteer. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for me. And I remember my first month of training, I really struggled without knowing the language. In my host family, we often joked that Google Translate was our best friend. But of course, as all things in life go, things got significantly easier. And here I am, 6 months later, continuing my exciting journey in the city of Vinnytsia. So during my time here in Ukraine, there's a couple things I think about quite regularly. The first thing is, what are my parents thinking back home? Are they worried about me? Do they even understand the work I actually do here? And if I were to go home today, would they be happy to greet me, or would they encourage me to engage in a different line of work? That's my first question, is what is my family thinking? After all, my culture definitely considers moving to a different country to do volunteer work for 2 years as unconventional, to say the least. And 2, what does it take to be an active member of society? I've lived here in Ukraine for a little over 6 months now, and most of the people that I have interacted with are so incredibly inspirational and active in their communities. And I don't know if that's an anomaly, but I've been blessed with that community here in Vinnytsia. So it makes me wonder, what makes them so active in their communities? And how can we as a society further encourage that active mentality? And what do we perceive as volunteering altogether? And what within us causes us to volunteer? And I guess that's an ancient question that goes back decades, even centuries. And the more I think about it, as the months go by, I feel like both these concepts go hand in hand. So why do some people volunteer more than others? Is it because they have more time or energy or money to put into their communities? Or is it because they have this deep background that causes them to dedicate their lives to a specific cause? Well, for me, I don't fit into either of those categories, so it seems that can't be the only reason. Living here in Ukraine, I see a lot of similarities in family values that also exist in Indian culture as well. And to me, it seems like a lot of how we define our goals in life and our decision-making process to be active in our communities has to do with our upbringing and our culture. And almost every day I get asked the question, why are you in Ukraine and why would you want to spend your time volunteering here? What's interesting to me is I get asked that question every time I interact with someone from one of the multiple different cultures that I identify with. And it's astonishing to me that so many people from so many different cultures don't seem to understand my personal perspective on altruism. And so I began to analyze why someone from each of these cultures would find my service here so outlandish, because I certainly don't find it that way. In fact, I think it's quite right for me to be here. And so I started by thinking about my own culture. Growing up in an Indian household, I was always told not to worry about helping out around the community or going to unnecessary events or even doing chores around the house, to the extent that I didn't even know how to do laundry properly until college, all because they were considered time wasters. You see, I was always told that academics came first and everything else in life would follow. And that's actually a really common ideology for the average Indian household. Now, digging deeper, the Indian diaspora in the US is often stereotyped as only focusing in academics and nearly nothing else. In the Indian community, we even have a common joke that Indians are either doctors, engineers, or lawyers. And if you're not one of those three, you're probably not Indian. And all jokes aside, you start to think, why do Indian immigrants in America care so much about engaging in one of these three professions? Is it because only those three professions make a decent salary in America? Well, that's simply not true, because there are multiple professions that make the same amount or more back home. You see, my older sister is a doctor, and slava bohu, my parents are so excited to have gotten one doctor to feed the stereotype in the family. And they are so proud. I asked them, why did you want her to be a doctor so badly? And they said, well, it's an honest and noble line of work that allows those to help people who can't help themselves. And it dawned on me that the Indian focus on education and lack of community involvement at a young age is because they believe in investing their time in education at a young age for greater humanitarian impact later on in life. Growing up, that's something I never put together, but thinking back on it now, that's kind of an incredible concept. Now, on the other hand, although I grew up in an Indian household, I still received an American education. And volunteer culture there is vastly different. In school, students are taught to be available and present, to always help their peers at any time. They're encouraged to engage in hands-on volunteering, such as going to visiting a homeless shelter once a month, or creating a canned food drive to help the less fortunate on the holidays. This is something that's very highly valued in American culture. In grade school, I was in an organization called Girl Scouts, which is basically very similar to the Ukrainian Plast organization. And I learned a lot of leadership and social skills from that community organization at a young age. Activities like that are highly encouraged in American culture. And my mom, being Indian, still thought that it was all just a waste of time, and I was just enrolled in it so I could make more friends. But fast forward to my high school years, suddenly, university applications all require a minimum of 100 service hours to accept a competitive applicant. And now my mom thinks it's a great idea for me to start volunteering. But my point is, in America, the education system has incentivized students to volunteer through the university admissions process and has further cultivated this concept of volunteering as a subsequent measure of success at a young age. The skills learned through the act of volunteering in America are highly valued, and that's something that's very different from that of Indian culture. And now, having lived in Ukraine for all but 6 months, I can't quite speak to the vast complexities of volunteer culture in Ukraine just yet. But having spent this time with Ukrainian youth through my work, I can say that there's something very special and unique about the way Ukrainian youth choose to spread altruism. There is a genuity to the altruism they choose to spread. It seems to me that Ukraine's close family and community values has allowed students to really value the concept of teamwork to better their community. And more noticeably, Ukraine has a long, deep history, and the resilience of its people often shows in more ways than one. And at this point in history, the youth that I work with are active not only for the sake of their direct communities, but also for the sake of their country as a whole. And that's something I've never witnessed to the extent that I have in Ukraine, and I think it's quite incredible. At the same time, I so often speak to my students that are so engaged and active in their communities, and they don't even realize it. These are students who are creating and writing grants for participatory budgeting initiatives to renovate their schools and creating eco-friendly solutions to solve problems around their communities. And for some reason, they don't consider themselves volunteers in the traditional sense. These students are so empowered, and it's heartbreaking to see that they don't seem to understand how I see how empowered they are. So, speaking of youth in Ukraine and globally, we see a significant rise in volunteerism over the past 2 decades. According to the UN Volunteers 2018 State of the World's Volunteerism Report, there was a record number of 109 million volunteers last year worldwide, volunteering both formally and informally, and growing in terms of ethnic and regional diversity. So why is this? What's different now than before the turn of the century? And it also makes you wonder, how many people around the world are just like my Ukrainian students who don't consider themselves volunteers and are uncounted for in this 109 million? It makes you think, people are spreading so much good around the world that's just going uncounted for. Now, although there are innumerable studies discussing the factors that affect this, one thing that seems to loom on my mind consistently is just pure, unfiltered globalization. And on a more specific scale is cultural integration and the access to global communications where people can recognize one another around the world and merge cultures in a way that was never before available before the turn of the century. This is something that's exclusive to the millennial generation. Now, in recent years, the term world citizen has emerged as a common label in the millennial generation. A world citizen, according to the World Service Authority, is an individual or human being that lives morally, physically, and intellectually in the present and relates directly to all humankind and all fellow humans openly, generously, and spontaneously. Fitting the role of a world citizen for the millennial generation is not just a lifestyle to abide by, but also representation of the access to the global platforms that allow people to empathize with one another around the world. You see, people are finding happiness in creating new communities online and abroad because the communities that their parents were blessed with don't seem to exist anymore on the global scale. For example, communities of immigrants are creating new fusion cultures such as Korean American culture or Indian British culture as a way for the millennial generation to identify with one another on a broader scale. And lucky for us, these communities are being created based on similar values and beliefs rather than physical and familial attributes. So my point is, if you were to look at yourself through the eyes of a different lifestyle or a different culture, would you consider yourself an altruistic person, even if you didn't consider yourself a volunteer in your traditional sense? For the Ukrainian youth in this room, have you ever volunteered or worked for a community organization for the benefit of your community? If you have, then in an American standpoint, you are definitively a volunteer. You are an altruistic person. Or have you ever thought, I just don't have time to volunteer right now or do anything around the community because I'm focusing on a bright future in my career and my studies? Well, then in an Indian cultural standpoint, you too are an altruistic person. Why? Because you are still an active and functioning member of society. And by sacrificing your time now, you are providing greater output in the future. And in a Ukrainian standpoint, as an individual focused on educating his or herself, you are leading your country to a brighter future. And that's altruism at its core. So what is exactly the outlook for the future of altruism? Should we be hopeful for the future of volunteering? I think yes. I think the easier it is for us to see the world around us, the easier it is for us to see pieces of ourselves in those we wish to help. And we see a personal investment to an altruistic act when we are able to empathize with a person who is in a position of need. And recently, we see that there's a real rise in all of this, right? So I am excited about this new generation, and I think it's important to take a step back and look at the big picture of everything. Your immediate environment might not realize that your efforts to be an active member of society for the time being, but that's okay because that's fleeting. As long as you are able to have your goal in mind and take a minute to evaluate the best way for you to emulate the role of a world citizen in a way that best aligns with your lifestyle and your beliefs, you're on the right track. And a point to the Ukrainian youth in this room, I'm really excited to see what this new generation of youth does for the world, the Gen Zers, as you're often called. Please don't underestimate yourselves and your talents, because you're already doing more than you may think you're doing. And if you're in this room right now listening to this TED Talk, then Vimolitsi, you're already on the right track. So you still have a lot to offer to this world, as the world has to offer to you. Дуже вам дякую.